The opioid crisis is just another step in America's unending war on drugs. For decades, our mission has been to stop these addictive substances from poisoning the minds of Americans. The war on drugs resulted in a counterproductive campaign that's led to more crime, more drugs, and more death.
With its costly, counterproductive behavior, the war on drugs was largely ineffective at dealing with the rise of drug use and culture, as well as the rise of the illicit drug trade. However, the war on drugs was successful in disparaging solid Democrats like the anti war protesters and African Americans through mass incarceration.
Americans had held an infatuation for drugs for centuries. One of the earliest encounters with drugs in America was the use of heroin after the American Civil War in order to be painkillers after surgery. Later on, many famous products were laced with different drugs. For example, powder cocaine was oftentimes used in medicines and drinks, specifically Coca Cola.
America's drug policy would rapidly change in the 1970s.
Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
that so help you God.
So help me God. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
President Nixon, aiming to represent the silent majority of Americans who supported the Vietnam War and detested drugs, declared drugs America's number one problem in America.
Nixon helped the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970 pass, dramatically increasing the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. He helped create mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. A classification system for the dangers of drugs was also created, and Nixon temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, the most restrictive categories of drugs, containing LSD and heroin.
Nixon's classification of marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug was perplexing, as marijuana was much less harmful than its Schedule 1 description, and even less harmful than legal drugs at the time, like alcohol or tobacco. Nixon's classification of marijuana shed light on what the war on drugs was really about, as John Ehrlichman, a top Nixon aide, stated,
You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalize both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Didn't we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Nixon started what is to this day the foundation as to why African Americans and Latinos disproportionately make up the prison population. Nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are black or Latino. Teenagers in college were smeared as criminals rather than purveyors of social progress, and Nixon's hardline drug policy set the stage for the massive incarceration rates to come.
Nixon's anti-drug campaign helped portray him as tough on crime, and the next couple of decades, politicians on both sides of the spectrum tried to portray themselves as tough on crime, cashing in reasonable criminal justice for political points. As an emphasis was put on punishment rather than rehabilitation, causing an endless cycle of drug abuse, especially in neighborhoods with high poverty rates.
Near the end of Nixon's presidency, the cartels in Colombia, Panama, and Nicaragua became very organized, with the organizations launching huge flying operations to transport drugs over to the southeast coast of Florida. The war on drugs wasn't escalated during the presidencies of Ford and Carter, but by the late 1970s, a very powerful organization known as the Medellin Cartel emerged in Colombia, led by Pablo Escobar. The Medellin Cartel monopolized the cocaine trade, controlling 80% of the cocaine smuggling into the U.S. and reaping $60 million a day. It operated off the west coast of Florida, using planes to fuel America's cocaine addiction. It was with the emergence of the Medellin Cartel that put drugs back into the spotlight for the U.S. election of 1980.
In the 1980s, the war on drugs would be taken to new heights.
To me, I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Now, I congratulate you, sir.
Ronald Reagan emerged as the president and he took a hard line against drug use, not only targeting drug dealers but also the consumers. Reagan increased mandatory minimum sentencing, adopting a zero-tolerance policy. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, started her Just Say No campaign to stop drug use, and advertisements and public service announcements were broadcasted nationwide on the television. The various public service announcements and Reagan's speeches indicate that the war on drugs during the 1980s was fueled by political hysteria rather than scientific research.
This is crack, rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool.
Reagan may have taken the war on drugs to new heights, but he also took the country to new lows. Under his tough-on-crime drug policies, incarceration rates skyrocketed, and once again the government focused far more on punishment rather than rehabilitation. Between 1968 and 1992, the annual number of drug-related arrests increased from 200,000 to over 1.2 million. One-third of those were marijuana arrests, most for mere possession. According to government estimates, only 12% of drug users are black, but nearly 40% of those arrested for drug offenses are black. Nationwide, 1/4 of all African American men are under some form of criminal injustice supervision, mostly for drug offenses. However, drug usage rates did not drop, suggesting that Reagan's policy aligned with Nixon's intended purpose of suppressing leftist citizens as well as black Americans.
This is further supportive of one of the biggest stains on the Reagan presidency, the Iran-Contra affair. The affair saw the CIA secretly funding Contra rebels in Nicaragua that engaged in the drug trade. Contra cartels would help smuggle cocaine into neighborhoods across America, and top U.S. officials knew this, but continued to have high penalties for using the drugs they helped transport into the United States, smearing drug users in order to increase his political clout. When the scandal was leaked, Americans began to realize Reagan's war on drugs was never really about getting rid of drugs. The 1990s saw little change in policy.
The presidents following Reagan continued the tough-on-crime drug policies on the federal level. Bush smeared his opponent Michael Dukakis for being soft on crime with his famous William Horton attack ad. George H.W. Bush's refusal to end the ineffective war on drugs did lead to riots in major American cities. Clinton then emerged as president, notoriously turning his back on campaign promises pertaining to drug policy reform. He refused to address and reduce sentencing disparities that disproportionately affected African Americans, such as the infamous 101 crack powder cocaine mandatory minimum sentence.
The war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure, but although the Fair Sentencing Act was passed and the federal government has been slow to counter the tough-on-crime policies set in place, while states are effectively decriminalizing and regulating the potency of drugs in order to reduce incarceration rates and overdoses, they aren't doing much to reverse the war on drugs, only end it. For instance, every year more and more states are decriminalizing marijuana, allowing for it to be legal for recreational use. However, state governments are less lenient in releasing Americans previously convicted for marijuana possessions. So while marijuana startups in places like Silicon Valley are generating millions in revenue, millions of Americans are rotting away in prison for having less than $100 of marijuana.
Rising drug use is still an issue in America today, and the opioid epidemic has taken center stage, with opioid overdoses doubling this decade. The rise of prescriptions for addictive painkillers such as OxyContin became a gateway for hardcore drugs such as heroin.
Christine Minhee in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy states,
America's opioid crisis is the latest battle in the war on drugs, with war-like casualties. Like war, our opioid crisis is an entirely man-made, sweeping epidemic of death. Major news outlets report that opioid overdoses have claimed more American casualties in 1 year alone than did Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
The coverage of the opioid crisis has also drawn backlash for the double standards it established for drug addicts. Throughout the end of the 20th century, African Americans were disproportionately targeted for nonviolent drug arrests, and little remorse was given to them. In the eyes of mass media, the addicts were the problem. But with the opioid crisis in recent years, where 79% of opioid addicts are Caucasian according to the National Institute of Health, the drug addicts are portrayed as victims of greedy corporations and an unfair system. This opioid crisis is covered as a public health problem, while the crack epidemic was portrayed as a crime problem. The double standard between the depictions of the crack epidemic and the opioid epidemic sheds light on the war on drugs' racially disparaging roots.
Nearly 50 years after it was started, the war on drugs was ineffective at stopping the rise of drug use and culture. Drugs like cocaine and heroin continue to leave neighborhoods and small towns across the nation in a decadent state. The tough on crime policies implemented during the war on drugs hurt these regions of the nation, as many non-violent citizens were convicted of drug possession and then stripped of their rights, all while drug use in America continues to climb. The war on drugs led to a mass incarceration which disproportionately affected non-white minorities. With something as scientifically complex as addiction, we shouldn't be framing public drug policy around political hysteria, but rather scientific research on how to effectively help Americans live drug-free lives.